so it says it's starting up the live broadcast of of YouTube. That should be okay. We are okay. All right, and now I'm going to start the webinar, and we'll wait for the attendee numbers to bump up a little. Okay, all right, so Al, you can take it away here.
You all ready? Okay.
Yeah, just go ahead and screen share.
Hi, everybody. I'm Al Kim. I'll be hosting this session 7 at 3 p.m. Eastern US time. We're going to begin with, before getting to our actual session, we have a brief announcement from Fernanda Ferreira and Brian Dillon. And here is their slide. So let me hand the floor off for a moment off to Fernanda and Brian.
Great. So thank you so much. I'd want to, on behalf of Johan Rourke and Brian Dillon, and Brian is actually here, so not quite on his behalf, but at any rate, all of us are delighted to announce the soft opening of Glossa Psycholinguistics, a sister journal to Glossa, a journal of general linguistics. And Glossa Psycholinguistics offers a new open access, open science venue for psycholinguistic research. We've recruited a great editorial team, including the associate editors, as you see on the slide, Jennifer Culbertson, Roger Levy, Tal Linzen, Sharon Pepperkamp, Petra Schumacher, Florian Schwartz, and Ming Shang. We are super excited about this venture. In collaboration with the team at Glossa General, we've established a journal that will accept brief reports, longer reports, registered reports, reviews, and theoretical pieces. We also have adopted an opt-in funding model for the journal where only authors with access to institutional or grant funds pay. If you'd like to get up-to-date news about our journal, please follow us on Facebook or Twitter. We anticipate the journal will be fully operational in the coming weeks. In the meantime, you can get in touch with me or with Brian at the email above that you see on the slide if you have any questions about submitting work to Glossa Psycholinguistics. We really look forward to hearing from you and to getting your papers. Brian, do you have anything to add?
No, I'd just like to add that, yeah, we really are excited about this and looking forward to hearing from you about it. So get in touch with us on Twitter, on Facebook, and via email. And we look forward to receiving your papers.
And I expect we'll be ready to go in a few weeks. We are still working on some of the details of the website, the submission website, as well as the face to the world. But we expect to, we're moving along, we're making progress. So thanks very much, Al, for the time.
Sure. Thank you so much, Fernanda and Brian, for that exciting news about Glossa. So now we can get started with our session. Let me begin with a couple of reminders about how the session will work. If you have questions for the speaker, you can send them at any time by clicking the question and answer Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom window in the tray, and you can write your question in there. You should indicate, if possible, whether you would like to read your question yourself or say your question yourself, or ask me to read it for you. If you want me to read it for you, then just indicate, read my question for me. Otherwise, I'll assume that you're going to read yours or give your question. If you want to be able to engage in a back and forth, then it may be better for you to speak your question yourself. There's also the discussion link in the on the CUNY schedule webpage where you could enter additional questions as follow-up after this is the talk is over. So there are your instructions as participants, and now let's get started with this session. And so I'm going to begin by introducing our invited speaker. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jeff Lidz as invited speaker and part of the special session for the conference. Jeff is a professor of linguistics at the University of Maryland, where he also holds the very cool title of Distinguished Scholar Teacher, something that I would love to have. He started off with a BS in journalism from Northwestern. He did his PhD at Delaware in linguistics, and then he postdoced at the Laboratory for Cognitive Science and Psycholinguistics at the CNRS, the National Center for Research in Science in Paris. And then he did a postdoc at Penn in IRCS in the heady days of the Institute of Research of Cognitive Science. And that's where I first met Jeff back in those good old days. And I remember a time when postdoc Jeff gave grad student me a thorough and convincing lunchroom explanation of the value of C command as a psychological construct at a time when I was not quite ready to understand appreciate the point, and I've owed him a debt of some intellectual gratitude ever since then. And this is actually affects strongly how I think of Jeff and how he works. He took his first faculty position in linguistics at Northwestern before moving to Maryland, which brings him to us here. Jeff has received major funding from the National Science Foundation, the NIH, and the McDonald Foundation. He's currently editor-in-chief of Language Acquisition. He's published extensively in journals of a wide variety, including journals in theoretical linguistics and psychological science and cognitive science, places including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Linguistic Inquiry, Annual Review of Linguistics, Journal of Semantic Language Acquisition, Cognition, Cognitive Science, and Cognitive Psychology and Trends in Cognitive Science. So he's all over the place. And through his career, Jeff has been a leading researcher in illuminating the relationship between the fundamental components of formal syntactic and semantic theory from linguistics and language acquisition. He's been an instrumental contributor to the theories of syntactic bootstrapping, which explain how children's learning of the meanings of words is constrained by the grammatical distribution of those words. For instance, he asks how might the learning of the logical argument structure of verbs be constrained by the syntactic complements with which those verbs occur. And he's worked on how children learn the referring properties of pronouns, how they learn to represent the syntactic dependencies, the linked components of a sentence, even when they can be displaced from each other by some long distance, including phenomena like WH questions and relative clauses and quantification, which I think he'll talk a little bit about today. And these are all core issues in linguistics, which have been studied for a long time. And I think what really distinguishes Jeff and makes his work deeply important is the care with which he's thought about the proper relationship between linguistic theory and non-linguistic cognitive mechanisms of learning and memory and world knowledge and event representation, and how effectively he's used experimental methods to tease those things apart, to illuminate them and to disentangle these things that are often commingled in a human mind, a child's mind. So he's helped us all get closer to a compelling account of child language acquisition. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor off to Jeff, whose title is Second Year Syntax, Discovering Dependencies.
Okay, thanks, Al. Does that work? Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's in presenter mode, not.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thanks, Al, for that really great introduction. It's weird to hear your life described by your old pals from when you were a child, so that's cool. Thank you. And it's great to be back here in Philadelphia, even if it's virtual Philadelphia. I have to say the food is much better in real Philadelphia. Anyway, let's get started. Okay, So as you all know, syntax concerns itself with dependencies between words and phrases. These dependencies can be realized locally, as in the case of a verb selecting its arguments, or long distance, for example, when that same relation is realized, say, by a WH phrase at the left edge of a clause. And I want to zoom in today to a very active period in syntactic development, the period just between 15 and 20 months, so a 5-month period, a period in which children are discovering these kinds of dependencies in their native language. In this period, we see children acquiring both the local argument structure dependencies and long distance filler gap dependencies. And so I want to ask two kinds of questions. The first question is just a kind of basic descriptive question, like what happens? Like, how do these dependencies emerge over the course of development? And the second question, how does newly acquired knowledge impact the developing parser? So to get a picture of the relation between the grammar and the parser. And that second question relates to a very old question in psycholinguistics, namely, how similar are the representations built in the process of sentence understanding and the representations that are characterized by the grammar? And so in a very influential paper by Tom Bever in 1970, he suggested that the perceptual system by which or through which we understand sentences give a kind of quick and dirty first pass that could quickly get you to a meaning, while the grammatical system may be lumbered along slowly behind. And this idea has descendants in current psycholinguistics and ideas like good enough parsing or shallow parsing. The alternative to that view is that grammatical knowledge defines a set of data structures, and parsing involves recovering an analysis that matches the constraints of that system through domain general capacity limited systems of attention, memory, cognitive control, etc. And so what I want to do today is to distinguish these ideas by looking at the very earliest stages of syntactic acquisition. And what we'll see is that as new knowledge comes online, we'll see its effect almost immediately in incremental processing, suggesting that there's no chasm between the mechanisms of sentence recognition and the data structures defined by the learner. So in favor of the one system view of the relation between grammar and parser. Okay, so here's a kind of a roadmap. So in the case of local dependencies, what we'll see is that by 16 months, children have learned something about the link between syntactic positions and thematic relations. But as they learn more verbs, they begin to use the kind of lexical information to guide their initial parsing decisions and predict upcoming structures. And those predictions maybe sometimes get them into trouble. Then we'll move on to long distance dependencies, specifically WH movement. And we'll see first that the grammar of WH movement is in place by 18 months and not before that. Earlier successes seem to be driven by the argument structure knowledge that's acquired earlier. And second, we'll see that children use that knowledge to make incremental predictive parsing decisions immediately after acquiring them. And so altogether, in both cases, we'll see that as the child acquires new knowledge of their grammar, that information is immediately incorporated into the perceptual mechanisms that underlie sentence understanding, and hence arguing against the view that these sentence understanding mechanisms use some kind of heuristics or build representations that are distinct in kind from those defined by the grammar. Okay, so let's get to it. So let's start with the case of local dependencies, argument structure dependencies. And we'll hear much more about this, I think, from Cindy Fisher on Saturday, I think. And what she'll show us is that before their second birthday, children seem to know quite a bit about argument structure. They can identify links between thematic relation and syntactic position, and they can use that kind of knowledge as a cue for what a novel verb means. So for example, in a case like the one on the top here, seeing these two events happening side by side, if they hear a sentence like the girl is gorping the boy, they'll look to the event in which the girl is the agent and the boy is the patient. And if they hear the opposite word order, the boy is gorping the girl, then they'll look to the one where the boy is the agent and the girl the patient. This kind of ability depends on knowledge of a link between syntactic position and thematic relation. And what we don't know really so much about is the origins of that link, which I think Cindy has some ideas about too. And so what I want to do first is to ask about just when those links are first acquired. And so what we're going to do is to ask not about how argument structure is used to inform verb meaning, but rather to inform the interpretation of the nouns that occur in argument position. So this was work that we did with Aaron White, who's now at the University of Rochester. And so what we did was to present babies with sentences like these, he's pushing with the gop, or he's pushing the gop. And so you have a novel word in the object, in a novel noun in the sentence at the end of the sentence, the gop. And even if you don't know what the gop refers to, you know in the first sentence that the gop will be the instrument of pushing. So if you know what a pushing is, you'll be able to figure out what the gop is. And in the second case, if you know what pushing is, then you'll realize that the gop is the patient of the pushing. And so we did, we gave babies experiences like these. So here's a sample trial.
Hey, look at that! She's pushing with the gop. Wow, do you see her pushing with the gop? Yay, she's pushing with the gop. Where is the gop? Which one is the gop?
Okay, so so we tested 16 and 19-month-old children with sentences like these. So here's an example. She's wiping with the TIG. So she's using a cloth to wipe a camera. And let's think about what has to happen from the perspective of the parser and the learner in this situation, trying to learn the meaning of the word TIG. So first you need a syntactic representation of the sentence. So you build a sentence where that you have a prepositional phrase with the TIG, which is modifying the verb phrase wiping. Because you know about how that prepositional phrase and the meaning of the word with relates to the event labeled by wiping, then you know that the TIG will refer to the instrument of the event of wiping. And so in this case, the TIG will refer to the cloth, the thing that's being used to wipe the camera. And so at test, when you're asked which one's the TIG, if you're like, well, if you know your language, you should choose the cloth. Conversely, if you see she's wiping the TIG with the TIG in direct object position, then you should build a phrase structure tree in which the TIG is the direct object, hence the patient of the wiping. And so the thing getting wiped in this case is the TIG. And so when asked which one's the TIG, you should look towards the camera. So we tested, as I said, children at 16 and 19 months, and we found a really interesting pattern. So here we have on the y-axis here, the mean proportion of looks to the instrument. So cloth up high, camera down low. We have 16-month-olds in the first 3 bars, 19-month-olds in the second. The circle is a control condition where we just say it's a TIG so that we know what your kind of baseline preference is. What you see is that the 16-month-olds, in the case where they got the novel noun inside a prepositional phrase, they looked more to the instrument than baseline. And if they heard the novel noun in the direct object position, then they interpreted that as the patient. And so we see different pattern in the 2 syntactic conditions. And oddly enough, in the 19-month-olds, that effect seems to go away. So the 16-month-olds seem to be sensitive to the relation between the syntactic position of a noun phrase, whether it's the object of the preposition or the object of the verb, and its thematic relation, and hence can find its referent. Whereas at 19 months, they seem to prefer to look at the patient independent of the syntax. Now, one of the things that is changing between 16 and 19 months is the child's verb vocabulary. So kids learn a lot of verbs in this particular period. And we looked at just the pattern of data in the 16-month-olds. And what we found was that as the child's verb vocabulary grew, then they did worse and worse on the condition where the novel noun was inside the prepositional phrase. But in the case where again, where it was in the direct object position, then they did better and better as their verb vocabulary grew. And so that gives us a kind of a puzzle. Why does knowing verbs make you worse at this task? And so we had an idea that, so first the 60-month-olds, they know the relation between the position of a noun phrase and its thematic relation. But at 19-month-olds, you get a dip in performance, which is due to interference from new knowledge, which is associated with knowing more verbs. And that's connected to a kind of predictive parsing mechanism. So let's think about how that would work. So first, in child-directed speech, for the verbs that we used in this task, they occurred about 83% of the time in transitive clauses and only 2% of the time in intransitive clauses with prepositional phrases. So there's this major distributional bias for transitivity among these verbs. And so we hypothesized that this is what would happen as the child is parsing the sentence. So they say they're parsing from left to right. They have a kind of left corner parser. So they've built a certain amount of structure. And then you hear wiping. And you say, okay, the child knows that wipe is likely to be transitive. And so she projects a direct object. Having built that structure, she hears the string with the TIG. But there's no place to integrate the preposition with the structure that was already built. That Q conflict is difficult for them to resolve, either because of a failure of conflict monitoring or difficulty with revision processes of the sort that John Truswell has talked about. In any case, the predicted structure wins out and the preposition is not integrated into the structure. And so the child finishes the sentence parsing the TIG as though it were the direct object. And so because they know the verb's subcategorization preferences, they end up misparsing the sentence. And then, of course, having misparsed the sentence, they can assign the appropriate thematic relation. That's to say, when they hear a sentence like she's wiping with the TIG, their knowledge of the verb wipe leads them to build a transitive structure, causing them to miss the preposition, and then assign the thematic relation to the direct object that's appropriate for being the direct object of the verb, in that case, the patient. Now, that was a bold idea, and so we thought we better find out if it's true. And so we thought there are two predictions that we could make if that were the case. The first prediction is that if we could satisfy the verb's transitivity requirements, we should be able to show that kids at 19-month-olds were in fact sensitive to the meaning of the preposition and hence get the correct parts and correct interpretation. And the second is if we could somehow remove that prediction for a direct object, we would get them to the correct parse and hence the correct interpretation. And so that's what we did. So first, how could we satisfy that transitivity prediction? So we said, well, let's put something in the direct object position. So she's wiping that thing with the TIG. And now, because the verb wipe will have its argument structure satisfied, then when they get the prepositional phrase, they will have no difficulty incorporating that into the structure and assigning the TIG to the instrument relation. And we compared that to cases like she's wiping the TIG with that thing, where again, this thing is an object position, so it's the appropriate thing to interpret it as the camera. Okay, and what we found, so again, same y-axis here, red is for the case where the novel noun is inside the prepositional phrase, blue for when it's inside the direct object position, we see this asymmetry. So, so when the verb transitivity is satisfied, then the 19-month-olds can use the syntactic position of the novel noun to identify its thematic relation and hence the meaning of the noun. Okay. Second prediction was that if we could remove the transitivity prediction, we could get the correct parse in these 19-month-olds. And so what we did was we gave them a novel verb in the same structure. So instead of saying she's wiping with the TIG, we said she's meeking with the TIG. Now, the verb meek is basically unknown to them, so they can't predict a direct object, and so they should rely on the signal to interpret the TIG as the instrument. And that is also what we found. So kids who heard, 19-month-olds who heard he's meeking with the TIG interpreted the TIG as the instrument, and those who heard he's meeking the TIG interpreted the TIG as the patient. So when you have an unknown verb, you're unable to make a syntactic prediction, and consequently, you can make the correct syntactic inference. Let me just emphasize that the 19-month-olds did better on this task when there were two novel words in the sentence than when there was only one. And so, in other words, in the context of Jabberwocky speech, we're able to reveal how they use the syntactic structure to get to interpretation. But when you use real words, sometimes knowledge of those words can cover up the footprint of that syntactic knowledge. Okay, so there's part one. What we've seen is clausal argument structure is in place by 16 months. Lexical argument structures, as they're acquired, are used predictively as vocabulary grows. Sometimes those predictions lead to trouble, as we saw in the 19-month-olds. From the perspective of parsing, the point is, as soon as you acquire the lexical subcategories, you're using them to drive local parsing predictions. So no reason to have two separate systems of parser and grammar. Let us now turn to long distance dependencies, WH movement. The first thing we did in this series of studies was something like this. So babies see a video in which two events happen. So first, first the white dog hits a cat. Then what's happening? Then the cat hits the brown dog. And and then that's the end. Okay, and then we have two dogs, one who was the agent of bumping a cat and one that was the patient of getting bumped by a cat, up here on the screen. And we ask something like, which dog did the cat bump, or find the dog that the cat bumped. And we tested 15 and 20-month-olds. We tested subject questions, subject relatives, and object relatives. And we found a very odd pattern. I'm not going to go into the details of that study right here, but the odd pattern was this. The 15-month-olds succeeded on both subject and object questions and subject and object relative clauses, whereas the 20-month-olds succeeded on the WH questions, but neither of the relative clauses. And so the fact that the 20-month-olds got worse than the 15-month-olds made us somewhat skeptical of the 15-month-old's success to begin with. That skepticism was fed by some other things that kids of this age can't do. So some non-adjacent dependencies, like, for example, the connection between is and the progressive, are not established until around 18 months. WH questions don't appear in production until around 20 months, and it seemed like a 5-month period would be quite a long way to wait. Struggles with object questions and object relative clauses persist into the preschool years, so it seemed weird that we didn't see any of that here. And most importantly, we realized that infants could cheat to get to the right behavior. And so here's what I mean by cheating. So let's imagine that the child parses only a portion of the sentence. So they hear, which dog did the cat bump, but they only manage to parse out of that, the cat bumped. That's it. And then they use perhaps what they know about the argument structure of the verb bump to fill in the rest, or at least some expectation about what else could be being talked about here. So they know the cat was the agent of a bumping, and then they look at the brown dog, not because they've connected the WH phrase, which dog, to the object position of the verb, but simply because that dog was the one that was involved in an event that had a cat as an agent and a bumping. Okay, and if that's right, then what we would expect is that their ability to use that argument structure knowledge would depend on them having argument structure knowledge. So it would depend on how many verbs they knew, or basically the size of their vocabulary. And so we tested that idea, tested the vocabulary, the effect of vocabulary on understanding of WH questions and relative clauses. This is work done with Laurel Perkins, who is now at UCLA. Okay, so here's what happened in this task. So babies see an event of, say, a monkey feeding a frog. Then they see a frog feeding a different monkey. And then simultaneously, they see those two events happening side by side. And then we're asked either which monkey is the frog feeding, which monkey is feeding the frog, or relative clauses, find the monkey that the frog is feeding, find the monkey that's feeding the frog. And what we found is that vocabulary, but not age, predicts looks to the target in the critical window. So here's what we see. So here we have looks to target. So that's going to be looking at the patient in the object question, looking at the agent in the subject question, as a function of vocabulary. And what we see is for both WH questions and for relative clauses, the kids with the larger vocabulary get to the right answer. Here, having larger vocabulary is helping you, but for exactly the same reason that it hurt you in the first set of experiments. Okay. So far, the prior results on the interpretation of WH movement are consistent with the 15-month-olds succeeding because they were cheating based on what they knew about verb argument structure. And so infants may be using their knowledge of verb argument structure to infer what to do in comprehension tasks without actually parsing the WH dependency. And that's plausible given other evidence I showed you about argument structure at roughly this age, but we really would like to have a more direct test because, of course, you can't reason from the vocabulary effect to this particular hypothesis. Vocabulary is correlated with all kinds of capacities in infancy. And so the vocabulary effect could be consistent with lots and lots of accounts of children's behavior. But we think it's a plausible hypothesis in this case. But still, we'd like to have a much better test for knowledge of WH dependencies and the role of argument structure in kind of getting there that's independent of interpretation. And so that's what we did. So we asked ourselves, how could we test children's knowledge of WH movement without actually relying on interpretive judgments, because the interpretations may arise via some other mechanism that hides what they actually know or don't know in their grammar. And so we said, well, how would we recognize WH movement or any kind of movement dependency? And the way we would recognize it is by a kind of complementarity between the WH phrase and something in the direct object position. So in other words, when you get the direct object, when you get the WH phrase, then you're not allowed to have a direct object. And when you have the direct object, you're not allowed to have WH phrase. Okay. So that complementary distribution between the WH phrase and the post-verbal NP, that would be a really good clue to them realizing the same syntactic relation. So we asked, like, could we make a kind of acceptability judgment task for infants? So we asked when infants represent WH phrases as arguments. So if we were right that the 15-month-olds were relying on argument structure, but not WH, then what you should see is the same pattern of judgments, if we could figure out how to get those judgments, to cases where you had a noun phrase following the verb, independent of whether it was a declarative, the cat should hug him, or an interrogative, which dog should the cat hug him. And of course, if there's no direct object like the cat should hug, that should be treated as equivalent to which dog should the cat hug, because if the child is using argument structure but not WH, then those cases without a direct object would be the violations. And if they were using argument structure and the WH relation, then you'd see a flip between the presence of the object and or the way that the presence or absence of the object was impacted by whether it was a declarative or an interrogative clause. In other words, it's grammatical to have a direct object in the declarative, but ungrammatical in the interrogative, and vice versa. Okay, so Laurel Perkins adapted a kind of infant listening task to probe syntax without depending on a meaning related to response. So in this task, babies watch some abstract shapes moving on a screen while they hear sentences. If they look away for 2 seconds, then the audio stops and an attention-getting video appears. When they look back to the screen, then the shapes and the audio return, and we just measure how long do they listen to these sentences. Okay. Right. Okay. So we had some babies heard declarative sentences, some babies heard WH questions, and then everybody heard either sentences with or without something in the direct object position. Okay, what we measured was how long do they, the difference in listening time to the sentences with something, a post-verbal noun phrase versus sentences without. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's a little video of what this looks like.
Ooh, which dog should the monkey hit her? Wow! Which goose should the mouse cover him? Hey! Which cow should the elephant bump him? Wow! Which cat should the bunny hug her? Ooh! Which bear should the dog tickle him? Hey! Which bee should the frog kiss her?
Okay, you got the idea. That trial was one where the child maxed out on looking time. Okay, so here's what we have here. So we're measuring a difference in listening time. So up means more looking or listening to sentences that have a post-verbal noun phrase. Down means looking to sentences that don't have a post-verbal noun phrase. And what we see at 15 months is no difference between the declaratives and the WH questions. We see about a 15% advantage of listening time to sentences with no object, independent of whether that's a declarative or a WH question. And again, that's consistent with the hypothesis that the 15-month-olds in those interpretive tasks were faking it. Okay. In the 18-month-olds, however, what we see is the opposite pattern. So the 18-month-olds show in the declarative a preference for sentences that have a direct object, and in the WH question, a preference for sentences that don't have a direct object. So here we see an asymmetry between the declaratives and the WH questions, suggesting that the 18-month-olds actually do represent the WH question syntactically. That is the relation between the WH and the verb. Okay. Good. Okay, so summing up so far, the 18-month-olds register the complementarity between the WH phrase and the postverbal noun phrase, and therefore represent the WH dependency. 15-month-olds do not, but they do notice the violations of the local argument dependency, again, suggesting that our interpretation of the prior data is correct, that long-distance WH dependencies are acquired by 18 months, and their earlier successes are only apparent successes. Okay. Now, we're going to put those things together, and I'm going to try a kind of triple somersault here. So remember this finding that 19-month-old children, when they hear a sentence like she's wiping with the TIG, because they know something about the transitivity of the verb, they miss the preposition, and they interpret she's wiping the TIG the same way they would interpret she's wiping the TIG. Okay. And remember that effect, the insensitivity to the preposition, goes away in the case that when there's a direct object. Show she's wiping that thing with the TIG. So in that case, again, the correct interpretation reemerges. Okay. So we've seen this so far. So now we want to ask, well, we just found out that it's not until 18 months that they're representing WH phrases. So what we want to ask now is, are WH phrases integrated into their structure incrementally while they're parsing? So in a project led by Mina Herzl, we put all this stuff together. So the idea is that if 19-month-olds are parsing the WH question incrementally, treating the WH phrase as filling the object role immediately upon encountering the verb, then they won't be in a position to miss the preposition. But if they're too slow, or if they're not able to incorporate the WH verb relation fast enough, then they might hear the verb, expect a direct object, and treat the prepositional object as though it was the direct object, just like they would in a declarative sentence. Again, despite the presence of the WH phrase earlier in the sentence. So, so again, if 19-month-olds are processing the WH questions incrementally, then they should not make the instrument error in WH questions, the error that they do make in the declaratives. Okay, so again, 19-month-olds, we expect when we say she's wiping with the TIG, they're going to think the TIG is the camera. But if we say she's wiping with the TIG, then if they can integrate the WH phrase incrementally, then they should think the TIG refers to the cloth. If they can't, they should make the error that they made in the declarative. Okay, so here is a baby doing this task, I think.
Look at that! What is she wiping with the TIG? Wow, do you see what she's wiping with the TIG? Hey, what is she wiping with the TIG? Ooh, that's a nice TIG. Where's the TIG? Which one's the TIG?
Okay, so here again, we have looks to the instrument. We have a kind of baseline initial look. They always look to the patient independent of what condition you're in. We're comparing the WH question to the intransitive control. So the WH question during training was, what is she wiping with the TIG? The intransitive was, she's wiping with the TIG. And what we see is this baseline preference for the patient in both conditions, which in the intransitive control is maintained when you say which one's the TIG, but is reduced. That is, they move towards the instrument in the WH question. So the WH question stops 19-month-olds from making the parsing interpretation error that they made in the previous studies and that they made in the intransitive control, which implies first that that we were right, that they understand, they represent the WH dependency syntactically, but also that they're parsing that WH dependency incrementally.
4.5 minutes, Jeff.
Thanks. So here's what we've seen so far. When it comes to local dependencies, clausal argument structure seems to be in place by 60 months. They understand the relation between syntactic position and thematic relation. Lexical argument structure, that is knowledge of the argument structure of particular verbs, is used predictively as vocabulary grows, and that can kind of distort data intake and lead them to make certain kinds of errors. That is assigning the wrong thematic relations to certain noun phrases. In the case of long distance dependencies, those seem to be acquired by 18 months and parsed predictively by 19 or 20 months. So in both cases, what we see is that newly acquired grammatical knowledge is used by the parser immediately upon acquisition. So it looks like it's hard to maintain a kind of two systems approach to the parsing grammar relation, because from the very earliest ages, as soon as some piece of grammatical knowledge is added, it's utilized by an incremental parser. I think I will stop there. So thank you.
We have about 12, 13 minutes for questions. There are two currently entered into the Q&A box, and I will begin by reading those. And if you would like to ask a question, please go down to the Q&A tray at the bottom of your Zoom window and enter there. Please indicate whether you would like me to read your question or would you like to read it yourself. So the first question at the moment is from, it looks like Jessie Snedeker would like to do her own. So I'm going to give Jessie the floor.
Partly because one of them got partly answered by Jeff as he was talking.
Okay.
I just want to verify, Jeff, that the experiment that you had at the end had a replication of the 19-month-old's failure with another.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's nice.
And we've also,
like a whole lot is hanging on.
I know. We were terrified of that. We were terrified of both parts of that. So we did a large scale replication with about double the sample size with the 16-month-olds. Then we see the very same effect of both the effect that they overall can do it, but the effect of vocabulary making them worse. And we've now replicated the 19-month-old data too. So yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Then I guess the question I'd like to focus on is about the WH questions, right? One of the things that I noticed in the grammaticality study, as you were saying them, is that the prosody on the WH with the pronoun in there is really weird, right? I think tendency to emphasize the place where the gap is, and then you have a thing that should usually kind of be a particle almost, right? Hanging there by itself. And I don't know if you want to think about this as part of the information that kids are using, or if it could be a potential workaround that could cause children to look like they were more competent than they really were.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So a couple of things. One about the stimuli is that they were created by splicing grammatical sentences together so that everything would be fully natural locally. The second thing is that in general, the end of sentence prosody of a WH question is indistinguishable from the end of sentence prosody of a declarative clause. And so we don't expect that prosody is the kind of thing that would drive acquisition of this. So like yes, no questions and declaratives have very different prosody, but WH questions have the prosody that's very, very similar to declaratives.
Maybe the best way to address my concern would be to low pass filter them and see if people could identify which were the weird ones.
Yeah, that's right. So that's one thing that we could do. We're trying that. And the other thing we're trying is to, we're worried about the splice because in the in a baby study, the ungrammatical sentences were spliced together, but the grammatical sentences were just produced naturally. And so we're doing an adult norming study kind of just to make sure that people can't detect those splices. We don't think you can, but we haven't shown that, empirically. So yeah, that's stuff we're doing. Thanks, Jesse.
Okay, I will read a question from Lisa Pearl. The question is, the impact of parsing limitations on intake is fascinating to think about. Given that kids seem to have WH dependency knowledge by 18 months and their parsing is limited before then, how much do you think the intake for WH dependencies is distorted before then? Parentheses, in some sense, how much of an amazing feat is it that kids get WH dependency knowledge at 18 months, given how skewed their ability to process WH dependencies from their input would be?
Yes, Lisa, thank you for that question. A big part of that question is answered by Laurel Perkins' dissertation, so I'll refer everybody to just go check that out. So let me think about this. So yeah, at the time when babies don't yet have the grammar of WH movement, then there's a potential problem in identifying the argument structure of the verbs to begin with. This is a problem that was noted by Steve Pinker and by Lila Gleitman when they were sort of fighting about syntactic and semantic bootstrapping. But this is one thing that they both agreed upon, which is that somehow the sentences that have some kind of transformation in them, passives, WH questions, relative clauses, would have to be filtered out in order to stop the child from thinking that those sentences had, the verbs in those sentences had different argument structures than they actually had. In other words, stopping the child from thinking that an object WH question was just an intransitive use of a verb that they already knew. And so what Laurel shows is that it's possible to filter those out without actually knowing which things to filter out. So she develops a computational model which kind of estimates how much of the noise, how much of the data that I'm experiencing should I attribute to noise due to me having a faulty parser versus how much should I attribute to actually being the grammar. And what she shows is that if you can estimate that noise properly, then you'll get a pretty good signal about which verbs are transitive and which verbs are intransitive. And consequently, you can use that knowledge of which verbs are transitive and which words are intransitive to discover the WH question. So when you see a transitive verb in a context where its argument is missing, you can go, oh, there must be a reason that its argument is missing, and then figure out what are the surface signals of WH movement in the language. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Lisa.
Okay, I'm gonna read a question by Ethan Myers. The question is, in the earlier examples with the nonce word gorping, the lexical semantic properties assumed about the verb change what picture the eyes might be drawn to. If you hear the boy is gorping the girl and assume that gorping is a verb with semantics like push and not ignore, then the picture with the boy looking toward the girl might be favored. But if you assume it's like ignore, then the picture with the girl looking away from the boy is favored. So do you think, on top of the transitivity bias you're noting in these experiments, there's some preference for more agent-like subjects, push, the car is meeking the TIG, and or more experiencer-like subjects, ignore, that guides the interpretation of novel transitive verbs?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's really maybe more of a question for Cindy Fisher than it is for me, but I think it's right that the expectation about transitive clauses, the kind of baseline expectation, is that subjects are agents and objects are patients. And I think that's why we don't think in those contexts that that the sentence means ignore, even though ignore is in some sense agentive, but it's not obviously agentive, you know.
I have a question from Lynn Fraser, which says, what is the relation between comprehension and production?
Well, Lynn, that's a huge question. I guess I'm not totally sure which question to answer. So like there's one answer to that question, which is that you probably have to be able to comprehend a sentence in order to produce it. That is, you have to have a certain grammatical structure available to you in order for it to enter into production. And so in that sense, you would expect comprehension to precede production. On the other hand, you can do a lot of comprehension that doesn't rely on veridical syntactic representations of the sentence you're hearing, as we saw in the case where you kind of missed the preposition or whatever, right? And in the WH questions, like you can kind of get the point and answer the WH question correctly when you're 15 months, even if you're not really representing that appropriately. And so you would expect in that case, there's also going to be an advantage in comprehension. That is, you're going to appear to understand things before you even have the grammar for them. But that's going to be much harder to pull off in the case of in the case of production. So I hope that answers what you're going for.
Lynn, I don't know if you want to jump in. You could be highlighted, but I'm going to read your question, which you posted a moment.
Let me jump in. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so the question is with respect to your argument for one system. It's based on children using their knowledge as soon as they've acquired it. And, that makes perfect sense. But if you have a detailed model of comprehension, it can't be exactly the same as a detailed model of production. Okay. So at that level, when you're arguing that there's one system, what is that system? Is it the grammar and comprehension, or is it the grammar and production?
Okay, good. That's an excellent question. And I kind of want to just like hand you off to Colin Phillips to answer it, but I won't do that. But here's the one system that I have in mind, that the grammar is the grammar. And there isn't really a parser per se. Like there isn't like a piece of psychology, which is the parser. And there isn't a piece of psychology, which is the producer. Rather, you have the grammar, and then you have memory, attention, conflict monitoring, cognitive control, like all that other stuff, which will show those other systems, when interacting with the grammar, will show their effects in different ways in comprehension and production. So you wouldn't see identical behavior in comprehension and production because you're kind of running the system in different directions and with maybe different constraints on memory and attention, cognitive control. And so I think the reason we might see asymmetries between comprehension and production is because of the way the grammar interfaces with other systems of psychology, not because of there being like one system for production and another system for comprehension. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. But then you're assuming that there are no language-specific principles of language parsing or of language production.
That's correct. That is what I think.
Yeah. Language specific meaning language. I don't mean, French versus English.
No, I understand. Yeah, that's right. So there are no language specific parsing mechanisms in the sense of mechanisms whose job is just to parse.
Yeah.
Instead, there's a grammar and a psychology.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. We have time for one quick question, which I'm going to read. I hope you have time to answer it. The question is from Roger Levy. Hi, Jeff. Thank you for this talk. It is really helpful to get the bigger picture as you see it. My question, going back to the original puzzle of why 19-month-olds don't successfully use with for thematic role assignment in declarative sentences, whereas 15, 16-month-olds do. What do you see as the child's state at 19 months that is leading them astray? Are they predicting too aggressively on the basis of overall verb statistics? Is there independent evidence consistent with such a picture?
Okay, yeah. So the prediction, I don't know if it's overly aggressive, but they're being aggressive in a way that's in a sense appropriate given the distributional characteristics of the language. So it's like appropriate to expect that those verbs are going to take direct objects. The 15 and 16-month-olds, especially so as their vocabulary is smaller, they have less information to go on, less distributional information to drive those predictions. And so like the difference between 15, 16-month-olds and 19-month-olds is how much they know about the lexical subcategorization properties of the verbs. what goes wrong, that there's a couple of options, I think. So one option is that having made that prediction, their conflict monitoring system is not up to the task of finding that preposition in the signal and going, oh, whoops, I made a mistake. So it could be a problem of noticing that the signal didn't match their prediction. Or it could be a problem like they made this prediction, then they got the signal which says you made the wrong prediction. And then when it comes to backtracking, that's a problem. So is there independent evidence consistent with such a picture? Well, I don't really know. So I don't know of a ton of evidence that shows that kids are great predictors at this age. That's what we're trying to find, is more evidence for that. And I don't know of good evidence about conflict monitoring or cognitive control, except in much older kids. So stuff that John Truswell, Jared Novick, and others have done. And so, well, that's the best I can do. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are out of time. And so I'd like to thank Jeff for that fascinating talk and everybody else for the robust discussion. And so now we will move on to our second and final talk of this session, which will be presented by Maximilian Dubkovsky and Roman Feynman. Maximilian will present, and the title of the talk is Evidence of Accurate Logical Reasoning in Online Sentence Comprehension.
Thank you very much. Can you see the slides? Awesome. Let me begin then. What is the status of logic in thought? Logic, to characterize it broadly, is the formal study of relations which obtain among propositions. Logical schematic capture rules which govern correct inference. The example here is the dictum de omni, known at least since Aristotle, which is the principle that whatever is affirmed of a kind can be affirmed of its subkind. For example, if all rats love to eat, then since spotted rats are rats, it follows that all spotted rats love to eat. While such schemata capture normatively accurate inferences, there has been a long-standing debate over what their status is in human cognition. This is to say, are such logical schemata the rules of thought? The status of logic in thought has been viewed very differently by the disciplines of psychology and linguistics. Research in psychology has tended to focus on documenting which logical tasks are more difficult than others and understanding why. For example, Wason constructed a series of deductive reasoning puzzles which involved selecting cards. Subsequent research revealed that people are most logical on Wason selection tasks when the scenarios are ecologically valid. For example, when the imagined context involves enforcing a social rule. Likewise, dual process theorists of cognition have argued that normatively accurate reasoning requires effort and does not come naturally in the absence of logical training. Sloman, for example, demonstrates that when told that birds have an ulnar artery, people are much more likely to endorse that robins have an ulnar artery than that penguins have an ulnar artery. In accordance with such findings, Daniel Kahneman proposed that logic is not a forte of system 1, which is the system responsible for automatic fast reasoning. On the other hand, we have certain branches of linguistics, such as formal semantics, which, in trying to understand the compositional nature of language, posit that language has a kind of logical form. Thus, implicitly, linguists credit language users with a rather high degree of logical sophistication. Noam Chomsky, for example, sees logical notions as embedded in their deepest nature in the very form of language and thought. This view of language as, in some sense, fundamentally logical allows for making sense of compositionality. It also predicts that at least some inferences, those based in the logical form of language, should be as intuitive, automatic, and effortless as thought and language themselves. Thus, the following question arises: can we find some evidence for fast and automatic reasoning? I'm going to give you an example of one logical notion that has been argued to be based in the structure of language, entailment. Entailment is a relation between propositions such that when one proposition is true, then another proposition is also always true. We already saw an example of this sort of reasoning in the dictum de omni. In our study, we will concern ourselves with the varying directions of entailment on the different arguments of the quantifiers some, all, not all, and none. This is to say, the notion of upward and downward entailment. Now I will go through some intuitive reasoning and illustrate it with Venn diagrams to show how entailment can be understood formally. Consider a sentence such as, some of the cats chased a mouse. I will refer to the noun phrase such as the cats as the first argument of the quantifier, and the verb phrase such as chased a mouse as the second argument. These are also known respectively as the restrictor and the nuclear scope. So first, we will tweak the first argument. Some of the angry cats chased a mouse. Since angry cats are a subset of cats, then if some of the angry cats chased a mouse is true, it must also be the case that some of the cats chased a mouse. This is to say, the former sentence entails the latter. In general, you can replace a subset here, angry cats, with a larger set, cats, and the sentence stays true. The Venn diagram captures this fact. The quantifier some means that the intersection of the two sets of angry cats and mice chasers is non-empty. Adjectives such as angry denote a subset of the noun they modify. Thus, the intersection of cats and mice chasers is perforce also non-empty. The other direction does not work, which is to say you cannot infer that an angry cat chased a mouse if you know that a cat chased a mouse. This is because, as the Venn diagram illustrates, it can be the non-angry cats that chased mice. So we cannot go from a superset to a smaller set. So to reiterate, in tinkering with the first argument of some, you can go from a subset to a larger set, but not in the other direction. Now consider manipulating the second argument of some, chased a mouse. Some of the cats chased a white mouse entails some of the cats chased a mouse, but some of the cats chased a mouse does not entail some of the cats chased a white mouse because the cats could have been chasing mice of other colors. So the result we arrive here, again, is the same as before. You can go from a subset to a larger set, but not in the other direction. And this is known as upward entailment. So far, we looked at both arguments of some and saw that some is upward entailing on the first argument because you can go from angry cats to cats, and it's also upward entailing on the second argument because you can go from white mice to mice. The opposite situation where you can go from a superset to a smaller set is known as downward entailment. To see downward entailment in action, let's have a look at a sentence with the quantifier all now, such as all of the cats chased a mouse. All of the cats chased a mouse entails all of the angry cats chased a mouse because angry cats are a subset of cats. And as the Venn diagram shows, all means that the set denoted by the first argument is a subset of the set denoted by the second argument. So you can go from a superset to a smaller set in the first argument of all. At the same time, all of the cats chased a white mouse entails all of the cats chased a mouse. Here, in the second argument, we can go from subset to a larger set. So we see that all is downward entailing on the first argument, but upward entailing on the second. And this tetrad is completed by not all, which is upward entailing on the first argument and downward entailing on the second, and none, which is downward entailing on both arguments. Thus, there is a quantifier for each combination of upward and downward entailment. So what is entailment good for? The notion of entailment is central to accounts of many linguistic phenomena. For example, Gricean pragmatics presupposes that non-literal meaning arises as an implicature computed over what was said and what could have been said. Crucially, the computation relies on entailment asymmetries between propositions. Likewise, most accounts of the distribution of negative polarity items invoke entailment direction, presupposing that this logical property can be computed effortlessly, accurately, and automatically by speakers without any logical training. Importantly, however, outside of acceptability and felicity judgments, there is little evidence that speakers compute this logical property during sentence comprehension. Furthermore, the linguist's view of language competence might be challenged on empirical grounds. Hoaxema, for example, shows that the distribution of negative polarity items cross-linguistically is very complex, which might cast doubt on whether a single logical notion, such as entailment, can truly be used to account for these facts. Now, several previous studies have investigated the online processing of entailment. For example, Deschamps and colleagues show that reaction times in sentence verification are affected by the quantifier's direction of entailment. And Agman and colleagues show that both negative polarity and downward entailment contribute to processing complexity. However, these previous studies have a limitation. They show processing differences between individual words and attribute these differences to underlying logical properties, but they don't test these inferences directly. In our study, we looked for signatures of entailment processing and spontaneous language comprehension. We designed 3 novel self-paced reading experiments. 2 of those experiments are described in the abstract, whereas the 3rd one is new. We just finished collecting and analyzing that data. We tested for signatures of normatively accurate logical inferences between quantified sentences during sentence comprehension. Experiment 1 tested whether participants will detect a logical contradiction in the target sentence by manipulating preceding context, and experiments 2 and 3 leveraged the variable entailment directions between the first and the second argument of a quantifier to test detecting something subtler, which is to say incorrect inferences in the absence of downright contradictions. We pre-registered our design and analyses on OSF. And now in experiment 1. Experiment 1 tested whether speakers detect logical contradictions. We ran 400 participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the participants read 12 items displayed line by line with line breaks at clausal boundaries. They pressed space to advance to the next line. We also had 18 filler items, which were just stories and did not have the structure of our items. Across participants, each item appeared in 6 conditions, which differed in what quantifiers were used. Here, we can see an example item. A group of scientists wanted to know whether spotted rats, who are pickier eaters than other rats, liked a new kind of food. They tested white, black, and spotted rats of both sexes. The scientists discovered that first quantifier of the rats love the food. Now that they knew that another quantifier of the rats love the food, they decided to issue a recommendation based on their findings. As you can see, each item contained a premise in line 4 and a conclusion in line 5, which began with, now that they knew that, presupposing that what comes next appeared earlier in the discourse. And otherwise, the 2 lines differed only in the quantifiers they used. And we measured the reading times of the boxed conclusion line as a proxy for processing costs. We used a design where participants revealed the vignette line by line, as opposed to word by word, because we made no predictions about where exactly the processing difficulty would be. So we looked for a slowdown anywhere in the region. In an earlier pilot study, we didn't find any differences between any of the conditions on line 6, so in the pre-registered experiments, we didn't plan on analyzing it. And to ensure that participants comprehend the text, we asked them to make a true-false response to statements about each item. The items were unrelated to our hypotheses, so as not to focus our participants' attention on the entailment inferences. For example, for this item, participants would be asked to evaluate whether the statement, "the researchers studied rodents," was true. Our design was such that there were 2 conditions where the premise was identical to the conclusion, 2 where it differed from the conclusion but entailed it, and 2 conditions where it contradicted it. In the identity conditions, the conclusion followed trivially from the premise. For example, some of the rats love the food trivially entails some of the rats love the food. In the entailment conditions, the conclusion was not identical, but it was entailed by the premise. For example, it follows from all of the rats love the food that some of the rats love the food. And in the contradiction conditions, the conclusion contradicted the premise. For example, some of the rats love the food contradicts the earlier none of the rats love the food. All of the conditions were significantly different from each other. In particular, we were interested in comparing the contradiction condition and the entailment condition. We see that participants took significantly longer to advance to the conclusion line when it contradicted the premise than when it was entailed by the premise. And this is consistent with rapid normatively accurate sensitivity to the entailment relations between these clauses. And while the entailment condition was slower than the identity condition, this might be at least for 2 reasons. First, the entailment condition might actually involve a kind of inference. And second, the identity condition involves a repetition of the exact same constituent, which might create a priming effect. In experiment 2, we use the same paradigm to test for the capacity to detect subtler unlicensed inferences, even in the absence of strict contradictions. We manipulated the quantifiers in both the premise and the conclusion, as well as the noun phrase in the first argument of the quantifier in the premise. We used test items such as this one. The first 3 lines and line 6 were identical to experiment 1. We changed lines 4 and 5 to manipulate whether the conclusion was entailed by the premise. Note that in general, there is absolutely no reason why statements that come later in the discourse should be entailed by what comes earlier. In fact, this is the unusual state of affairs. What we had to do here is to build in a strong enough presupposition trigger to bring out that effect. And the best we could come up with was now that they knew that. So here, lines 4 to 6 went, the scientists discovered that quantifier of the rats, spotted rats, or male spotted rats like the food, love the food. Now that they knew that the same quantifier of the spotted rats love the food, they decided to issue a recommendation based on their findings. Unlike in experiment 1, in experiment 2, the quantifier was kept constant between the premise and the conclusion line. The premise noun phrase appeared with 2 modifiers, 1 modifier, or no modifiers. The conclusion line, on the other hand, always appeared with 1 modifier. Our design was such that the premise noun was a subset identical to or superset of the conclusion line. So 4 quantifiers and 3 containment relations yielded 12 experimental conditions in total, but don't worry, they actually reduced to a 2 by 2, and I will walk you through how. So now, depending on the combination of the quantifier and the containment, there were 4 conditions where the premise was identical to the conclusion, and so it trivially entailed it. These conditions will be shown in blue. 4 conditions in green where the premise differed from but entailed the conclusion, and 4 orange conditions where the premise did not entail the conclusion. An elegant feature of our design is that within quantifier, we're looking at differences in reading times among lines that have identical lexical content. So whatever the difference is on the critical line, that difference must be due to the preceding context. Here, you can see the 12 conditions schematized. For example, if we look at a quantifier which is upward entailing on its first argument, such as some, when the premise noun phrase is a subset of the noun phrase in the conclusion follows from the premise. For example, some of the male spotted rats love the food entails some of the spotted rats love the food. When the premise noun phrase is a superset of the conclusion noun phrase, for example, some of the rats love the food, now that they knew that some of the spotted rats love the food, we get an unlicensed inference. When we look at a quantifier that is downward entailing on the first argument, such as none, the pattern reverses. And so it is the inferences from a subset to a larger set that are unlicensed. For example, none of the male spotted rats love the food. Now that they knew that none of the spotted rats love the food is an unlicensed inference. The 12 conditions can also be represented in this abridged fashion where the particular lexical items have been abstracted away and only the information about entailment relation is retained. Now, let's have a look at the results of experiment 2. The 12 conditions here are grouped by quantifiers. The ident conditions, where the conclusion is trivially entailed by the premise, are given in blue, and you can see that they are faster than the other 2 cases, which is a good sanity check. The conditions where the conclusion is entailed but not identical to the premise are in green, and the conclusion and the lines and the conditions where the conclusion line is not entailed are in orange. We find a main effect of containment with superset conditions generally slower than subset, and this is expected because in the subset conditions, the critical line contains only lexical material premise found in the premise. For example, when going from male spotted rats to spotted rats, whereas in the superset condition, there is a new word. For example, going from rats to spotted rats, the new word is spotted. What matters, however, is the interaction of entailment and containment, which you can see as the difference between the green and the orange bars within each quantifier. Here, we group the upward and downward entailing quantifiers together and drop the ident conditions to show the relevant interaction of containment and entailment more clearly. This interaction is significant, showing rapid sensitivity to logical relations between clauses. At last, experiment 3. Experiment 3 differed from experiment 2 only in that we manipulated the quantifier's second argument. We use items such as this one, where we manipulated not the set of rats, but rather the vegetables they ate. Thus, the premise contained clauses such as some, all, or none of the rats liked vegetables, leafy vegetables, or frozen leafy vegetables. We had 12 conditions again as in experiment 2, but whether the premise entailed or failed to entail the conclusion was different according to the profile of the quantifier. Thus, the premise follows from the conclusion in the subset conditions for some and all, and in the superset conditions for not all and none. Recall that in experiment 2, the premise followed from the conclusion in the subset conditions for some and all, and in the superset conditions for not all and none. Here we can compare experiments 2 and 3 directly. The conditions with some and none stay the same across the two experiments, but the conditions with not all and all flip. Thus, we predict that the conditions with some and none will pattern in the same way across the two experiments. However, not all should pattern with some in experiment 2, but with none in experiment 3. Likewise, all should pattern with none in 2, but with some in 3. I want to show you the results of experiments 3 together with experiment 2 with quantifiers grouped by entailment. So in experiment 3, we again found a significant interaction of containment by entailment, which is consistent with rapid sensitivity to logical relations. However, due to the large effect of superset, the interaction of containment and quantifier is difficult to see. So now I will show the partial residual graphs to make the interaction more visible. Here, with an experiment, the subset trials have the mean of subset trials subtracted, and the same goes for the superset trials. This makes the interaction easier to see by removing the main effect of containment. We predict the same pattern of results in experiments 2 and 3 for some and none, because they have the same direction of entailment on both the first and the second argument. However, we expect all and not all to flip. So this predicts a 3 interaction between experiment, containment, and whether the quantifier flipped or not. We didn't find it, which might be because the quantifiers, not all the quantifiers behave as we would expect them to. In particular, some and none are the same. Some and none, which are the same in experiment 2 and 3, behave in the same way. Our predictions are also borne out for not all. However, all behaves in an anomalous fashion. We don't have a good idea for why all is behaving differently, but we welcome suggestions on how to interpret that data. In summary, our findings suggest that language processing involves automatic, accurate, and spontaneous logical computations, even in the absence of a task that requires making those inferences to verify text comprehension. This view differs, for example, from what is assumed by dual process theories of cognition. For example, Delays and Pennycook give an overview of recent advances in dual process theorizing. They observe weak signatures of rapid, normatively accurate reasoning, but they explain them as learning processes in which key principles have been practiced to automaticity. On the other hand, our findings are anticipated by frameworks which take some logical inferences as naturally intuitive, such as natural logic and reasoning of Brain and O'Brien's. Such inferences may even be baked into the grammar along the lines of Gajewski's L-analyticity. Now, our main suggestion is that the compositionality of language and some inferential thought may both derive from the same cognitive mechanisms. But how can we square our findings with decades of psychological research, which argues for the opposite? A methodological consequence of our proposal is that some logical competence, specifically that which is required to account for linguistic competence, is more easily revealed by tasks which involve ecologically valid language comprehension and do not require test taking or puzzle solving, as those are designed to be challenging in a way which obscures natural logical competence. Finally, our tasks revealed processing signatures with adjectival modification. Obviously, there are other types of inference which might not follow from the compositional nature of thought. Thus, we suggest that our findings may open up a whole new set of empirical questions about the relation of logic to thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maximilian, for that interesting data and thoughts. The question board is open. There is One question in the box currently by Jesse Snedeker. Jesse's question is, what was the alternative hypothesis? That folks cannot reason in this way seems unlikely. The Wason cases are very different. They only do so later. How much later? This is pretty late. Put another way, what do you mean by automatic? And how is that different from the learning theory in dual process theories? Would it make a different prediction here? I hope my prosody captured Jesse's question appropriately.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, to answer the question broadly, I think that one way of construing a lot of the literature on dual process theorizing would be that people wouldn't be able to reason in this way. At least that is not what's anticipated by statements such as the one from the recent paper by Denise and Pennycook. Now, obviously, this depends on what your interpretation of key principles being practiced to automaticity is. If your interpretation of that means is that this is what is acquired in the course of acquisition of a natural language, as all linguistic humans do, then there really isn't a difference between these two positions. However, our understanding is that at least some of the authors in the dual processing literature have argued that that sort of logical competence, which we show results in processing signatures as in our studies, is something that people do actually, the capacity that reveals an actual capacity that people do have. I would like to bring attention to a particular difference in the methodologies used by a lot of the extant literature which investigates people's logical capacity in the dual process theorizing, where people are given tasks which are intentionally supposed to be difficult, and then they are asked questions about, and then they are asked to solve tasks which are challenging. Whereas what we are doing here is showing that that the signatures of logical processing can be detected even if we don't ask any complicated questions about the logical relations which obtain in the text. I am not sure about the part.
Maybe I can jump in at this point.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, one thing I'm trying to ask is, what do you really mean by automatic, right? Sometimes what people mean by automatic is really rapid, which is probably something different. Sometimes they have in mind that something can't be controlled, happens regardless. I think all you mean by automatic here is if I don't explicitly ask you about this, you still do it. So you still extract meaning.
That's correct, yes.
That's
yes.
all that's meant here?
Yes.
Okay. And because I'm trying to see if there's some other time frame on which you think it could have happened, right? You guys are coming at the end of the sentence. It's taken a few seconds, even in a fairly highly repetitive environment. It seems like that's plenty of time, right?
Yes, correct. So some of the tasks which we are implicitly contrasting this with are studies which show that some of that logical processing actually is actually postponed, and the slowdown is only observed when you're asking a comprehension question specifically about the logical relations that obtain in the text that you are presented with. So,
okay. And how much of that do you think is about your presuppositional context?
Could you repeat the question?
How much of that do you think is about the kind of context you created with this very, very strong presupposition, allowing you to say the obvious? So you might imagine it'd be very difficult to get processing evidence of online logic, because typically, if it's logically entailed, it ain't worth saying. So how much of this might really just be about the shift to a presuppositional context? Is that the main argument here?
If you're yes, so we had to create this strong presuppositional context specifically to bring out the effect now the question is, does that presuppositional context mean that the inference is non-automatic? We take presupposition to be a part of natural automatic language processing. And so the creation of that, it doesn't seem, are you asking if the presupposition?
Well, I don't know what automatic means
automaticity?
still, right? Automaticity seems like a concept you're buying from a theory that you're rejecting. A theory that says there's one automatic root and one non-automatic root. What does automaticity mean in your theory?
It happens in the course of natural spontaneous language processing and in an unprompted fashion, in a way that is not brought explicitly to the attention of our participants. This differs from a lot of the tasks in the dual processing literature, where you are being asked to explicitly solve logical puzzles or evaluate whether statements follow from other statements. We're not doing anything like that. We're just giving our participants a vignette they read without them really knowing that what they're being evaluated on or what is being tested is their ability to connect the sentences in 4 and 5 logically as they are reading the text.
So it does seem like that should become a predictable aspect of these vignettes. No particular horse in this race. It's an interesting study. Thank you.
So what we did is we also had 18 fillers which were not structured like these. So these were only a minority of the vignettes we used. And in many other vignettes, we had 5 to 6 line items, which roughly had story-like structure, but had nothing to do, didn't involve any of this quantify-related reasoning.
Hi, so we perhaps have time for just one quick question, and there's a question waiting from Roger Levy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. First of all, I want to say this is a beautifully designed study. My hat's off to you to pulling this off in design. Really beautiful, beautiful data. Very interesting. I want to ask you, this actually relates to the answer that you gave at the end of Jesse's question. Helps me clarify my question, which is I'm trying to understand how to square your results with the classic. Like it's not that it's not hard to create apparent errors in very simple logical reasoning in natural language contexts. Classic simple syllogistic reasoning errors, some A or B, some A, B or C, therefore some are C, some A or C, classic example. So, and I wanted to ask you how you would square your results with those classic results. And maybe a specific version of that question would be, would you predict, because you, at the end of your answer to Jesse's question, you said, well, we are not drawing attention to the actual task. It's sort of backgrounded. Would you predict, for example, that if you designed a version of your studies that if you could set up the right control conditions, where you had like some A or B, some B or C, and then it continued, now that we know that some A or C, blah, 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 would you expect that you would actually see processing difficulty in that syllogistic error condition relative to appropriate controls, error-free syllogistic setups that have, once again, that you're where the conclusion is set up in the in a presupposition, in a now that we know type callback to the previous discourse?
Thank you very much. I'm really happy you enjoyed our design. So what you're saying by those classic syllogistic tasks are things like some A are B and some B are C. So something kind of similar to things like birds have and all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a little more complicated, of course, but sure.
Right,
yeah,
right.
I mean, these are, you could use these too. Yeah, I guess, how do we understand failures on these given success in your task?
I would say there are a couple of possibilities here. One possibility is the interference of world knowledge. So I mean, here one genuinely might say that penguins are less prototypical of a bird than birds, which interferes with this reasoning capacity. Or maybe to answer the question at an even higher level, I would say the fact that you can make people fail on a task the fact that a task doesn't reveal some underlying cognitive capacity for something. The fact that you succeed at making people fail at it doesn't mean that people don't have that capacity. So we're showing that the capacity exists, right? There might be many reasons why people don't have the capacity. Another thing that I would draw attention to is what we are actually using in our study is linguistic stimuli of a very particular nature. We have a noun modified by an intersective adjective, which restricts, which creates a proper subset of that noun, right? This does not necessarily need to translate. So the inference, it's possible that the inference from some dogs barked the inference from some brown dogs barked to some dogs barked might be simpler or might be processed with a different system than an inference from some penguins jumped to some birds jumped. So
we're going to need to wrap up quite soon, so we're a little bit over time.
And to answer your final question, I suppose, yes, we would predict that that including syllogistic tasks like that in this presuppositional context would also yield processing difficulty signatures, barring all other factors which might the tasks which have been used in the past more complex than what the tasks that we created were.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maximilian, and thanks everybody for the questions. This is the end of this session, and we'll see you soon at the next session, which is session 9 at what time?
In 15 minutes or so.
15 minutes, short break.
Yeah.
Sorry, we ran a little over.
Okay, bye. And I'm going to turn off the webinar and come back in.